Welcome boys and girls, Costini here with my top 5 beginner campaigns in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Now a couple of things to mention on the subject is that when you're talking about beginner campaigns, one has to consider the DLC dynamics for a particular race. If a race has some very important content locked behind DLC, then that automatically disqualifies it. So for Skaven, you could consider Rattling Gunners and Jezzails. For other races like the Greenskins, you could think about casualty replenishment and those kind of aspects. But anyway, at number 5 is Heinrich Kemmler, or the Vampire Counts in general, though I would probably recommend Kemmler more for a beginner than either Vlad, Isabella, or Manfred. I mean, I'd certainly recommend many campaigns over Manfred. Though, with Kemmler, you actually have a good amount of possibilities available in this campaign, more so I would argue than in Vlad's campaign. See, Vlad's campaign can force you down a certain path of where you have to wipe out Altdorf, take Altdorf. You do have that still for your long campaign victory condition as Kemmler, but not, crucially, your short campaign victory condition. So that gives you a good amount of flexibility in this campaign, just from an objective standpoint. But then you also have the climate situation. So you have wasteland, you have mountain, you have temperate, you have desert. So if we look at the campaign map over here of what kind of climate that Kemmler has, you find yourself in a situation where there's a very, very good portion of the campaign map that is flat out available to him to just take. So I think that is a really good selling point from this campaign perspective. Another thing to also point out is with regards to diplomacy. So you get the diplomatic relations benefit with Warriors of Chaos, Demons of Chaos, Beastmen, and Norska, but on top of that, Vampire Counts inherently have a fairly substantial diplomatic relations benefit with the Empire. Well, they rather nullify the aversion, the inherent aversion that the Empire has with them. Not that it's particularly bad as an aversion. Like if you look at Bretonia, it's the actual aversion of Bretonia is only -10 when you're looking at it. If we look at the Empire, it's -40. But you can nullify that, so you kind of end up in a neutral situation. And that's just the default one. There's ways of improving the situation even further with infiltrating noble houses, or if you're able to get a confederation going of Vlad and Isabella. One of the chief benefits, however, for the Vampire Counts is the fact that they don't really need any DLC. I mean, there's only one DLC available for the Vampire Counts. You can also consider Vampire Coast and Mongols, but realistically, you do not need any DLC to have a fairly good time. You just need to own Warhammer 1. I do think it's reasonable enough to say that's a good enough baseline to get going. So you need to obviously own Warhammer 3, you need to own Warhammer 1 to access Vampire Counts, and from my point of view, I think Kemmler is the better starting campaign than Vlad and Isabella. I mean, Vlad and Isabella can be a bit tricky as a campaign. They're not necessarily that difficult, but I also think like Kemmler is a lot better than a lot of people give him credit for. I mean, you do have Krell as a summonable Lord in Baal, who's pretty solid as duelist. You have a decent amount of magical capability, though over here I focused on, a Bev army skill line and special skill line in this campaign situation, and you do have a dynamic starting position in the sense you do have different choices in how you handle those choices, and the enemies or friends in this campaign can define this campaign. You also get the Red Duke potentially as a confederation option quickly enough in this campaign. So there's a good amount of possibilities available in this campaign from the very beginning of it. And I would not ignore what you can achieve over here when you're playing this campaign as Kemmler. I think it's a really solid campaign for beginner players. For veteran players, I'd recommend Vlad and Isabella far more, but I'd probably not recommend necessarily the Vampire Counts, though to be sure, Vlad and Isabella are a perfectly good choice as well. At number 4, we have Lokhir, Fellheart of the Dark Elves. Like with the Vampire Counts, you do not really need to own any DLC for the Dark Elves in order to have a good time with them. To be certain, DLC, the Malice Darkblade DLC, is absolutely worth it from the perspective of getting a master hero, but it isn't necessary in this campaign. The baseline Dark Elven roster of Dreadspears, Blackheart Corsairs, Dark Shards with shields, having replenishment as hero, having Blackhearts, having lore choices, hero choices, unit choices is all very good and solid. So that is one of the reasons I would recommend the Dark Elves in general. This particular campaign with Lokhir, however, has to do with a couple of things. First off, Cathay is a really good starting area of a campaign map because you do have different enemies, different situations to be dealing with, and a bit more of a dynamic campaign inherently in Cathay, unless you're playing Gelt and you're just very secure in that little corner of his, or Nakai, I guess. But usually speaking, when you're talking about Cathayan campaigns, there is a good amount of flexibility and there's a lot of different interesting choices to be made over here in Cathay. Even from just a pure diplomatic standpoint. Because if we look at Lokhir's campaign objectives, yes, he does need to take out certain settlements, or he can have them through vassals or military allies. Okay, his long campaign does require him to deal with the High Elves, fair enough, that's a fairly typical thing for Dark Elves. But early on, you do note that there's no faction that you need to eliminate over here in order to achieve victory. So that is a great thing. But on top of that, you can also make diplomacy work with a lot of different factions in this campaign. So you can straight up ally Cathay if you want. You can ally Snitch and burn Cathay to the ground. You can ally Chaos if you want to. Those kind of decisions do exist in this campaign. And I think it's a fairly interesting early game campaign. Like, to be sure, Morathi has more long-term potential, far more long-term potential than Lokhir has. But Lokhir has that very sweet early game, especially in the sense that you can get as many black arcs as you can. He doesn't have to wait for a very long right cooldown. He also gets a lot more post-battle loot as an alternative to being forced to summon black arcs. So I think that's a really strong benefit that Lokhir does end up having in his campaign. He's a fairly solid legendary lord with a fairly solid army that he does have access to. He does have this special black arc over here. And with black arcs, you can always recruit black arc corsairs from tier 1. So you can end up recruiting a bunch of really powerful armies very quickly during the course of his campaign. It is recommended to have the Malice Darkblade in DLC, the Shadow Blade, because masters can make a difference. But still, with corpse cards for vampire counts, like vampire counts can benefit from corpse cards and a couple other things, you really only want the Dark Elf DLC for the master's hero. And you may not necessarily need masters all that much either. So just a note on that subject. So I think it's a good starting position. I think it's a more interesting and dynamic campaign. And then you do have various sea lanes and a decent amount of climate flexibility over here. Though you do have some really harsh climate situations over here, especially on mountain and wasteland. So there's limitations on this, but you do have temperate island, you do have temperate, you do have frozen, you have savanna, you have jungle. And chaos waste is not too bad either. Could be better from a climate standpoint, I do agree with that sentiment, but it's still a really solid situation of a campaign. And number 3 is Thorgrim, Grudgebearer of the Dwarves. You only need to own Warhammer 3, and the baseline dwarf roster is pretty good enough. There are certainly some things missing, but from a unit perspective, you're not really going to feel the lack of Dwarven DLC. Where you are going to feel the lack of Dwarven DLC is with Confederation of Legendary Lords, specifically Belegar and Malachi Maccason. But with beginner campaigns and with a good starting point, when you're looking at the Dwarves, there's only 2 DLCs that you may want to purchase for them. So that is the Thrones of Decay with Malachi and Belegar, potentially with Belegar. Again, you don't strictly need them. Because when you're looking at the Dwarf Army roster, the baseline one, you get things like Thunderers, Iron Drakes, Quarrelers, Cannons, Grudge Throwers, Gyrocopters, Engineers, Runesmiths, etc. There are 2 important things that you're really going to miss out if you don't own DLC. One is the Dragon Slayer for casualty replenishment, and two are the lore choices, or Rune Lords and Demon Slayers. I'm not sure, by the way, how it works with Thoric Ironbrow if you don't own Warhammer 2. So if you own Warhammer 1, Warhammer 3, but if you don't own Warhammer 2, I don't know how that's going to work out with Thoric. So if you have any clue on that, please let me know. But anyway, with respect to Thorgrim, sure, not having a casualty replenishment hero can be an issue. But then you have things like Rat Poison, which is very quickly available, so that's 5% casualty replenishment rate. And if you can play this campaign, you can obviously get Grombrindle as a Legendary Lord. And Grombrindle can give you some casualty replenishment faction-wide. And on top of that, you also get Gotrek and Felix, so Felix gives you replenishment. You can manage it. It's not the most ideal situation, but it's not like a greenskin situation where not having a casualty replenishment hero hurts you. Especially because dwarves, unlike greenskins, have a bunch of heavily armored units that won't necessarily take that much damage to begin with in battles. Most of the time, casualty replenishment matters, not necessarily as much for the dwarves. I mean, people have said that dwarves could just be the auto-resolve campaign situation. Okay, with that said, why would I recommend Thorgrim? Well, I think Grombrindle is too much bullshit. Though, yeah, if you want a cakewalk of a campaign, you can play Grombrindle. But my recommendation with Thorgrim is you do get these extra heroes, so you have more heroes to play around faster. You do get an Age of Reckoning benefit. And you do get a bunch of quest battles, so you do have that dynamic to deal with. But then you also have a campaign situation. You've got Scrag, you've got Gorbat, you've got the Skaven, you got Skarsnik. So you do have a lot of things on your plate, but you are kind of secure, but not necessarily the most secure Legendary Lord in terms of starting position. So it can work out well, but there's some risk involved in this campaign. Now, of course, the lower the difficulty you're talking about, things are obviously going to be a lot more manageable on lower difficulties. But I think a good beginner campaign is one that does force you out of your complete comfort zone. I don't think a good beginner campaign is one where you just annihilate everyone that stands in your path and you're going down a linear path as well. So that's one of the reasons I would not recommend Balthazar Gelt as a beginner campaign for a lot of different reasons from that perspective. Powerful campaign, Empire's pretty solid, but just not a campaign I'd recommend, or Elspeth von Draken, for instance. So obviously that's a DLC campaign, so that by itself disqualifies it. So either Thorgrim or Grombrindle, but I just think Thorgrim has that more interesting, dynamic campaign start position. And what's great about dwarves is because the Guaranteed of Confederation, even if you don't own any of the DLCs for them, you still will get some Legendary Lords. And I think it's also great to play a campaign where you don't just have a short-term objective, but you're looking at longer-term objectives that are fairly well done over here through the Great Book of Grudges. So that's a really great system in a campaign, though again, you're going to benefit having Belagar and Malachi, their DLCs in this campaign, but it's a good starting point, and it's a good race to begin with, and to then buy DLC for that race going forward if you're interested in that. That is my view. Pretty interesting starting position, good enough roster, lacking one hero and some lore choices that are felt, to be sure, but you can still manage quite well without them. I would know, like, I've played, like, before Thrones of Decay came out, I got access to the Dwarf rework, then I got access to the Thrones of Decay content. And I can tell you, even without the Thrones of Decay DLC, it was a hell of a good time playing dwarves in that situation. So yeah, Thorgrim, number 3. Good middle point of a campaign, I would say. And number 2 is Emperor Karl Franz. Now, this is one of the hardest campaigns in the game if you're playing on higher difficulties especially, but I do think it is also a really good learning campaign at the same time. And it's clearly a campaign designed for new players. It might be a sink or swim type campaign situation where you either learn how to deal with the situation or you're going to get obliterated. But on the flip side, I don't think that's necessarily a bad situation for a new player. Mind you, I'm the kind of person who just jumps into every new game that I play on the highest difficulty and I just deal with it. That said, I think there are a number of factors that do make this campaign worthwhile. So first off, you do have a good amount of diplomatic options, especially because of the electoral machination system. With Imperial factions and then with Order-type factions, so Dwarves, Cafe, High Elves, that's something that works. On top of that, you do have a good amount of campaign power with various benefits over here. And you have such a starting position between Bretonnia, the Empire, the mountains over here, that you do have a lot of different factions to interact with. Furthermore, I would also dare say, beyond the fact that Karl Franz is such an iconic character, and the Empire is such an iconic race, the Empire is in a really good situation as a race. Even on a baseline level. So, when you look at the Empire, you have 2 DLCs, well, 3 DLCs, right? Rim the Grave, the Beast and a Hunter, and then Thrones of Decay. But you don't need any of those DLCs to have a pretty good solid unit roster and campaign experience for the Empire. Sure, you might miss out on things like Huntsmen and Archers or Null and Ironsides. I would recommend getting the DLCs, especially Thrones of Decay. But you do have a casualty replenishment hero, you have a melee hero, you have a Witch Hunter. You are going to be lacking the Engineer if you don't own Thrones of Decay, but you do have artillery options, magic options. And what I think works well about the Empire is that you have a good amount of flexibility in terms of the kind of units they recruit. Like, let's just consider the situation that you have in this campaign very quickly. Like, you have some pretty basic infantry, but they do get the job done. Then you have some range units, crossbowmen, handgunners. You have skirmisher cav pretty quickly. And then you get things like Empire Knights or Reichsguard at Tier 3. That is a really good situation in terms of unit recruitment, because it means you do have a fairly versatile roster of units that can deal with a lot of different situations. Sure, it's not the best roster. You don't have the best infantry or the best range units or the best artillery necessarily, but you do have just a bit of everything, right? And I think that does help deliver for the Empire, and it will push you in a direction where you're learning to deal with different things, like dealing with regular range units as opposed to handgunners, dealing with single entities because you do have steam tanks, dealing with artillery, dealing with melee infantry, dealing with cavalry, dealing with magic. That is what makes this campaign such a really good starting point for a lot of different people. The sole reason I'm not putting this as number 1 is because this is Warhammer 3, not Warhammer 1 plus Warhammer 3. In the sense that you do need to own Warhammer 1 in order to play this campaign. So I do think it's very much worth it, but if you just literally bought Warhammer 3, obviously you're not going to just have access to this campaign. So that is one downside. The problem is, though, with Warhammer 3 factions, you don't really have a good choice of a Warhammer 3 faction for the most part. Like, you look at Kislev, like, I would not recommend Kislev to a beginner. Even with all the improvements, I think it's gonna teach people the wrong lessons about playing the game. Like, whenever I talk about things like this, I always go back to something like Spirit of the Law, a YouTuber focused on Age of Empires, what he said about the Huns. Like, the Huns are a really good starting point for a lot of people because they're so easy to play in Age of Empires, but they'll also teach people the wrong lessons. This is one of the reasons I would not recommend Bellicor. This is the reason I would not recommend Cafe or Greenskins. Oh, Greenskins have more to do with the fact that they do need casualty replenishment, unlike, say, the Dwarves. They do need that casualty replenishment hero, but that's part of a DLC. So, and it's a DLC for Warhammer 2. Sure, you can buy it individually, but it's just worth pointing that aspect out. Anyway, there is one race, however, that is part of Warhammer 3 that I would recommend to beginners, and specifically one legendary lord. Finally, at number 1 is Arbaal, the Undefeated of Khorne. This is a Warhammer campaign that is available to everyone, and Khorne's unit roster situation is fairly solid enough by default, though you will certainly benefit from having Champions of Chaos and Omens of Destruction. Though I would say Champions of Chaos is probably more important because you do get the Exalted Hero of Khorne, you get Chaos Knights of Khorne. Those kind of things are very, very damn useful to have in a campaign as Khorne. But even by default, You do get cultists, so you do have that casualty replenishment hero. You do get blood reapers for campaign movement range. So those things are very useful to have just by a default level. Now, Khorne isn't the best race in terms of unit variety, to be sure, because you've got a significant melee focus, and one could argue that it is too easy of a campaign situation. I can understand that, but I think what makes Arbaal's campaign very interesting, and a really good campaign to start your experience in Total War Warhammer 3, is you do have this objective-based campaign with the challenges of Khorne. And this system has always been a great system ever since it was added with Oxyatl, because it is taking it based on Oxyatl's campaign system with those kind of dynamic objectives. I think a dynamic objective system, as opposed to just playing in a very comfortable campaign zone, is a really good way to go when you're starting out with Total War. Because you will be sightseeing pretty much across the entire world if you're playing an Arbaal campaign. And you may very well encounter far more Legendary Lords than in most other campaigns. You might not get an objective for a Legendary Lord, but a Legendary Lord probably will be close by. So it can be a good learning tool to learn what various Legendary Lords can do in battle and how to tackle those Legendary Lords. So from that perspective, it is great. And there's also something at risk in this campaign, because if you lose a battle with Arbaal undefeated, well, there are going to be consequences for that. Not campaign-ending consequences, but certainly consequences all the same. So you do want to be careful when you're playing this campaign, but you also want to be extremely aggressive, because Khorne is Khorne, for very clear and obvious reasons. So I think from that point of view, you do have a good starting point. It is the best campaign of Khorne in the game, and it is one of the best campaigns in general. And one could argue it is very easy, sure, compared to, say, Karl Franz. But I think this is more of a pick your own adventure type campaign. It can be as hard or as easy as you make it out to be. Truthfully, if all things were equal and you could get access to all Legendary Lords in the same fashion, I'd probably do the ranking different. But Arbaal does benefit from the fact that he is a game-free Lord that is available to literally everyone. You don't need to buy a DLC, you don't need to buy a game, you don't need any of that. It is beneficial to get 2 DLCs, to be sure, Champions of Chaos and Omens of Destruction. There are benefits in that, but again, you don't need them. The baseline unit roster of Khorne is good enough to get you through your entire campaign. And that, as I've stated, is not something that you can necessarily apply to every damn race in Warhammer 3. So I think there's a lot of benefits, tangible benefits, when you're playing this campaign. That's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.